Hello there. Good afternoon for those who are in Europe, and good morning for those in Latin America. Good evening for those who are in Asia. I hope I got that right. So welcome to this session, which is a session where we're going to be essentially trying to understand the way in which the ideas and methods of the Transformative Innovation Policy Consortium are working across different geographical spaces. And the question that we really want to understand and address is, as TIPC evolves, as it grows, as we hope it will, what are the implications when these spaces are very, very contrasting and very uneven? Okay. Now, the first thing I'm going to do is provide a very brief introduction just to the names and the institutions of the people that we have here, and in that we're going to be talking today. And then I'm going to say a few words about about the motivation for this session. So I'm Matthias Ramirez. I work at the Science Policy Research Unit of the University of Sussex. I'm a senior lecturer there. And I've been working with TIPC from the very beginning, and much of my work has been in Latin America. After I talk, I will invite Alejandra Boni, or Sandra Boni, who is from Ingenio in Valencia, and she will be one of the panelists and who has been involved in the work, particularly with Vinnova in Sweden for TIPC. She's developed a lot of the work on formative evaluation. After that, Cayetano Pena, who is at the University of Utrecht, and also has been heavily involved in the work of TIPC, in this case with Climate Kick. Then we have the pleasure of having with us Imran Patel, policymaker from the Department of Science and Innovation, who has also supported and been a champion of Transformative Innovation Policy Consortium from the very beginning. He's our policymaker on the panel, and we're going to ask him a few questions and reflect about this issue that we're going to be talking about. Then we'll see if we have some questions, and hopefully we'll be able to do that. And then at the end, I want to bring in two very important people for the Transformative Innovation Policy Consortium. Jordi Molas, also from Ingenio, has worked with us from the very, very beginning. Played a very important role and has a whole trajectory of work on science, technology, and innovation policy, and particularly evaluation. And he's going to reflect on both the question and the discussion, and also Johan Schot, who is also, of course, from the University of Utrecht, and who's the director of the consortium. So those are the introductions. Let me therefore, I will begin, because one of the things that we need to think about is this question of, and is central to the future of transformative innovation policy, is this question of geography and how the ideas of transformative innovation policy are implemented in different geographies. But the question isn't only that. I suppose you could say that the real ideas that launched the Transformative Innovation Policy Consortium was the paper in Research Policy, 2018, I think, by Johan Schot and Ed Steinmueller, where they actually called for a new third frame of science, technology, and innovation policy to be formed on the principles of transformative innovation policy. And they called for this to be a new meta framework, a meta framework with principles and with instruments as well. Now, this means that there is a call for transformative innovation policy to be applied across the board, to be applied in different geographical scales, where often these are very, very uneven socially and in terms of their levels, the sort of problems they face, the challenges they face, and also places with very different histories. So the idea is therefore that transformative innovation policy, just like other frameworks of innovation policy, such as system of innovation and to some extent mission oriented, has become, the idea is that this also becomes a meta framework. So the agenda of the the transformative innovation policy of TIPSI is highly ambitious. Okay, and I wouldn't say that we are there yet in terms of it becoming a meta framework yet, but at the same time, perhaps to go initially a little bit slower in terms of its diffusion is not a bad thing, because past meta frameworks, which have expanded very, very quickly, I think there's some questions about how effective they've been when they expand very, very quickly. On the one hand, they can become the flavor of the month, if you like, and when tied to big budgets, the question is, how much impact do they have, and to what extent do they really end up replicating what was already being done before, and therefore actors who frame their realities or their geographies in a particular way just to some extent carry on doing that, but with a set of different words. And therefore you often see, in my case, for instance, in Latin America, frustration from some of the original authors of frameworks like systems of innovation, or promoters, who find that their ideas are being used for all sorts of initiatives, and the words are really devoid of the original content. And the attachment, frankly, of a consultant to some of these new policies doesn't really fix the problem. So the result is at best a partial change, where all the nuances that are important are left out, but at worst, no change at all. Becomes a little bit a case of same ideas in new bottles. So this is, I think, a challenge for transformative innovation policy, because all the approaches of transformative innovation policy embrace the principles that it is necessary to understand and incorporate the complexities that context, specificity, and different places imply for sustainable transitions. Therefore, if we fall into this trap, if you like, then that can be quite negative, particularly for us. So we have to think about that as we grow, and hopefully as it becomes this. I think it also goes to the very heart of the definition of what a meta framework actually is. So let me therefore spend just the next 5 minutes talking about the way in which we have tried to understand this process, because what we're trying to do is in this discussion is not only, we have to do two things. I think we have to frame how we understand the process of spatial differences within TIP, and then try to look at the cases, and then try to understand what is happening, how TIP is landing and is being interpreted in the different areas. So to do that, I'm going to just share this presentation with you, which I'll do now. Let me see. I'll just okay, share screen, and hopefully this will work. Okay. Are you able to see my screen? It begins with maybe one of the presenters can just let me know. I can't see you. Let me see. Yes, I think there's a yes there. Okay, right, because I couldn't see. Right, so I'll just assume that I can't hear you, so I'll just, right. So this is what we've done. We've gone through a number of literatures associated to, for example, scaling within the transitions literature. We've also looked at some of the literature around geography of transitions, which are very interested in multi-scale actor networks. And we've also had to look at, because we're dealing specifically with policy, and this is something which perhaps is not present so much within the transitions literature, we've had to look at the spatiality of policy as well. And what we've, I'm not going to go through how we've dealt with that because we don't really have time, but you know, we're writing a paper on that. It's almost written now. If you're interested, please get in touch. But what we think that we can add to this is two things which I'm going to add now. We build on this. And the first one is that we need to understand, obviously, the way in which actors represent their spaces. So if we're dealing with South Africa, if we're dealing with Vinova, if we're dealing with Climate Kick, how do actors actually see their spaces? And we've divided this up into two types of, it's a very simplistic one, but it's a starting point, two types of framings. The first one is an absolute framing, which is a framing of policy which is based on fixed criteria bounded through some sort of standardized measurement. So if you think about something like you have a policymaker who might be thinking about mobility in a city, so he or she might think about mobility in terms of a standard criteria, such as how quickly it is to get from one side of the city to the other, or from work to shopping, or something like that. Okay, and it's usually a very fixed and a rigid way of thinking about that particular problem, and it has implications for measurement, because it could be, for instance, just the time it takes to get from A to B. And what you have to do, therefore, is try to follow this frame, is to reduce the complexity of the problem to some single variables, such as, for instance, plus or minus. And this is very, very often used as a way of simplifying particular problems, as a way of getting quick results, which can be measured, and often fits in quite well with an auditive control type of evaluation. Okay, very quantitative, simple type of evaluation to deal with certain problems. Okay, now this particular, we called it an absolute framing. There's a whole history here in the philosophy of science, which tries to look at problems in this type of way. When you have big complex problems, you divide them up into different bits, and then that way you simplify the whole problem. The different way of doing it, the alternative, which is probably closer to the spirit of what we're trying to do within transformative innovation, is what's called a relative framing. So complex phenomena cannot be understood without reference to everything else going on around it. And this looks at interactive and context-specific phenomena. So going back to our case before about how we want to think about mobility, we might want to think about not just driving, but we might want to think about walking, we might think about cycling, we might think about other forms of public transport of mobility. And therefore, the ways in which we understand it are relative to what's going on. And also, and this is very, very important, that there are choices. In the absolute framing, there aren't really too many choices. It's about following one route. With a relative or relational framing, there are choices about the way one looks at things, and also choices of measurement. Do we want to measure the time it takes? Do we want to measure to get somewhere? Do we want to measure the experience that people have? Do we want to measure the externalities that creates? So there are choices as well of measurement, and that fits better with a more flexible form of formative evaluation. So this is actor representatives of spaces. And let me tell you something, we might all want to be in the relative framing, but already we have seen in the cases, and I'll give you a hint there of what we find both examples of absolute framing and relative framing in the case studies that we have done with TIPC. Okay, so that's one very important thing that we think is how actors frame their spaces. The second one, which I want to share with you, is this idea, okay, so what's been the process by which the TIPC experiment has actually happened, and how do we understand how this may be applied in the different places? Well, this is the way that we've done it. So we begin within an academic environment, okay? So the ideas of TIPC around formative evaluation, around theories of change and so on, experimentation, were often developed within a very academic network, with just academics generally talking to each other. And of course, whether we like it or not, we have ways of thinking, we have ways of expressing our ideas, and we have frames of the way we do it. But the idea is then that this is then implemented, the methodology within with policymakers. So therefore, we have these two circles, and two things can happen here. One is that the framework is applied without any change. In other words, it becomes an immutable space. The network space does not change, does not move. It's the same people, same ideas that are applied. Or we can have what we call a new space, which is where academics and policymakers come together, and we're going to call that a fluid space. And the reason it's fluid is for two reasons. One is because you have different people, policymakers and academics, who have different ways of framing the world, different priorities, and then they come together and something happens in a sort of transdisciplinary different knowledge. So that's one reason why it's fluid. The second reason why it's fluid is because as a consequence of that interaction, the framework begins to change as well in response to the particular context in which it's being applied. Okay, so it's a fluid space for those two reasons. The idea is then that this passes over into a with stakeholders, which could be industry stakeholders, civil society, and then we have an even more fluid space. So we called it a complex fluid space, because then you add another group of people into the middle, and that really becomes a more complicated space. So really what we'd like to know is how this process is emerging. And then finally, what I want to show to you is this is the sort of options that we can see. So we begin within an academic space on the left, which is influenced by this relative framing, because that's the way we think in generally. But then when we apply with policymakers, two things can happen. Either it can go up to an absolute framing. In other words, policymakers take the ideas of transformative innovation, the ideas of experiments and theories of change, but they apply that in an absolute way. Why? Because their framing of their space is still that, a very technocratic way. Alternatively, they could continue within the relative framing by applying it in a more contextual way, in a more complex way. Okay, and that would sort of be within these two spaces, and they would create this sort of fluid space. And at this point, what we really want to understand is which of these two are happening. Maybe they're happening together, and if we are maintaining within the relative space, how does that happen? What works? What's been difficult? What have we learned about making that fluid space actually work, and what's coming out of that? You'll see that we haven't extended the arrows to the stakeholder space, because in general, there hasn't been a great deal of that within TIP as yet. So that's the framework that we're sort of using. That's the questions that we're asking. So what I'll do now is I'll stop sharing. We're going to go back to these slides in a minute, but we'll stop sharing just for the moment, and we'll bring in the panelists to begin to ask the question. I hope the panelists are ready to begin the discussion. The first question then I'm going to ask will be to Sandra or Alejandra. Sandra has worked with us a lot in the case of Sweden and Vinnova. Now, Sandra, our discussion of absolute and relative framings of policy allow us to distinguish between how actors frame their spaces. Now, this differentiates approaches that are perhaps driven by more technocratic, single indicators, as opposed to relative approaches that take into account context and are more flexible. This is something I think, in my experience, that policy practitioners welcome, but they're not always sure how to implement. Our interview suggested that both these framings sometimes exist in their intention. So you played a very important role in developing formative evaluation, which is one of the mechanisms to try to maintain us within this relative framing. So in your experience, how did you use formative evaluation to maintain the experiments? And is there anything specific that you learned from the experience?
Thanks, Matthias, for the opportunity to reflect. If you don't mind, you can share the presentation again, and I can say something about spaces and keep the conversation from your subtly. Yeah. Well, thanks for the question and for the approach to the formative evaluation and to the methodology. What I did is I used the your approach about spaces, to try to think about the process, our engagement with Vinova. And what I can say is the formative evaluation methodology and the 12 transformative outcome, which are the basis of our approach, in my view, have been developed in a mutable fluid space, but with differences. At the beginning, at the moment of co-producing the 12 transformative outcomes and the transformative and the formative evaluation methodology, I think the power, if you want to say in that way, or the influence was more on the academic environment. So at the beginning, we had more influence in producing this methodology and also in developing the 12 transformative outcomes. But I think they were created in a mutable fluid space, not in an absolute space, because co-creation, is something that happened in mutable fluid spaces or in complex fluid spaces, but it's something that happened between different actors. So at the beginning, in the co-production of the methodology and the 12 transformative outcome, that happened in this space with more influence or more power from academic environment. But, and this is the other reflection on the engagement, during the engagement with Vinova properly, the definition of which one are the relevant outcomes, which one are the relevant indicators, and the other components of the methodology, of the formative evaluation methodology, the influence of definition of that shift to the policy environment. So we are still in this mutable fluid space, but at the beginning, in the design of the methodology, with more influence from us, from the academic side, and during the implementation and the design of the theory of change and all the things we are doing in our engagement, the influence shift more to the policy environment. This is one of the ideas that came to me when analyzing the engagement. Can you go to the next one, please? This is the sketch of 4 transformative outcomes that we developed during our engagement in Vinova. And the definition of this transformative outcome was made by the policy makers, by the policy practitioner, not from us. We act as we act as facilitators of the process. So we are still in this mutable fluid space, but the definition of the outcome and which one were the most relevant outcomes for the policy food team in Vinova, who was our partner in this engagement, was something that was designed and suggested by the policymaker team. So the prioritization of the outcomes and on the indicator was something that came from the policymaker team. And you can see, well, there are outcomes connected with regime niche interaction. There are outcomes connected with regime issues, but something that came out from the engagement is the group, the policymaker group, the food policy team, they prefer to focus the formative evaluation on outcomes connected with the regime, because we can discuss later on why they decide to prioritize the outcomes connected with the regime. I think it's something that has to do with the mandate. It's something that has to do with the definition of the intervention, of the policy intervention. It's something that has to do with interest. So we can discuss the reasons, but the selection of the outcomes and those outcomes that are more related with the regime instead of niche actor was something that was that came in our interaction and is something that was defined by the policy maker team, by the group in Vinova. And that brings me to the third and last slide. Matthias, please. So my thoughts on that is, okay, we we kept the formative evaluation in this mutable fluid space, although the methodology, this is something that I think can be prepared to be operationalized in a complex fluid space. So I think the formative evaluation methodology and the 12th transformative outcome is something that we can use in different spaces, in mutable and in complex fluid spaces. No? I don't see any problem or inconvenience to adapt the formative evaluation approach to work in these complex fluid spaces. But in the engagement with Vinova, because they decide to remain and work more in the regime actors, inside Vinova, inside the organization, or in connection with other regime actors, we remain in our engagement in this mutable fluid space, and we didn't get to the complex fluid space. So we didn't interact with other stakeholders, except maybe with some interviews that we did at the end of the process. But I think that the majority of the engagement took in this mutable fluid space instead of migrating or moving a little bit to this complex fluid space, which I think is more interesting in my view, and also that brings into the conversation other actors, mainly actors from the niche, which are really relevant for transformative innovation policy. And that's all from my side to answer this first question.
That's lots of very, very interesting things there, Sandra. I'd love to have lots of follow-ups here, actually, lots of follow-up questions. Let's maybe leave them to a little bit later, because there's all sorts of issues to hear about whether TIPSI really has tools to move into the stakeholder space. I remember seeing Christian from Climate Kick talk about knowledge management tools and so on. But let's leave it there. Let me bring in Caetano now. Caetano, you've worked with Climate Kick and TIPSI and put a lot of effort into development instruments and tools through the Mobile Transformation Lab. And I'd like to talk to you about that a little bit, because this is something which, tools and instruments, more codified, if you like, ways of working, have become almost compulsory as a way of implementing policy in an actionable way. So this shift from the academic sort of discursive area to this policymaker, there's a demand for these ideas to become actionable, and these instruments are very important, perhaps for scaling and for diffusing. But also, instruments and tools have been criticized, not all of them, but they can be criticized for supporting decontextualized implementation of frameworks. So they promise clarity, they promise order, they promise control, they promise standardized procedures, but they're often ineffective at dealing with perhaps complex problems, especially when applied with very pre-specified criteria, where actually what the people who are trying to use them are trying to get is the correct use of the tool rather than the correct or the desired outcome, if you like. So this is something that we're having to deal with. So what was your experience of using these tools in Climate Kick? How do you think these can be used effectively to support perhaps more relative framings? Is it a positive, a negative, or a bit of both? Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Matthias. Thank you, Sandra, as well. Sandra already presented a bit of the methodology we used. But let me begin by saying, well, first, I'm Caetano Pena. I'm at Utrecht University at the Center for Global Challenges. But originally, I come from Brazil. I'm on leave from a position of assistant professor, and there I work with policymakers. So it's not so much only that what those absolute framings offer in terms of inequivocal or decontextualized tools, but also what your counterparts, usually policymakers, expect, and they expect some straightforward answers, and that's also a dilemma there. For instance, I used to work with the idea of mission-oriented policies, and I wanted to advocate in Brazil for the Ministry of Science and Technology transformative missions, but what they expected was more straightforward technological missions that are easy to define. They wanted a recipe there. But let me not talk about that. I will talk about my experience in the Climate Kick motion project. I want to begin to talk about the tools to refer to a saying that most people know. It is by psychologist Abraham Maslow who coined it. People know him for his pyramid of needs, but he also is the one who said it is tempting if the only tool you have is a hammer to treat everything as if it were a nail. And this is actually a concern that we had throughout the project from the beginning, because it was really tempting to simply apply the methodology of TIPSI, the TIPSI module-based methodology, decontextualized from everything. The solution in our case to avoid this decontextualization was actually threefold. First, we applied the tools together with the counterparts. So that fluid space was not out there. We had to constantly build it with the stakeholders and with the partners and policymakers. And we were working together with sister projects from IIT Climate Kick, SUSMO, Sustainable Shared Mobility, Saturn, and Acton NBS. So we had to be constantly working with them, deploying that methodology, and the whole process was co-developed with them. They would bring in their doubts, their questions about those framings, those absolute framings, about the framework of transformative outcomes. It was not really relatable in the outset. What was that? And their criticisms, their insights and suggestions brought us down to earth and to apply the tool in a way that would ensure that what we were saying was relatable to their specific context. So the first point is to do it together with those that have their expectations and their needs, and that know the context probably better than us, academics. Second, the TIPSI module-based methodology is already a flexible tool. It is conceived as a flexible tool. So although it can be seen as something that comes from this absolute top-down transformative innovation policy framing, it is constructed bottom-up. So it is adaptable to specific contexts and to specific settings, for instance, different projects, but also different countries, municipalities, or even different projects, to different levels that we'll be operating. Maybe we will be working at the niche level where new experiments are emerging, or we'll be working together with regime stakeholders, those that are already, they are incumbent and might be resisting the transformation. And also it is adaptable to specific needs, whether to support the design of the policy experiment, to support its implementation or its monitoring, as it were in our cases. Each of those three projects we were working with deployed the tool that we had at hand, the TIPSI module-based methodology, differently. It depended also in terms of the evolution and in what stage the policy process was. Some already had a theory of change, some not. So the final point was that this tool, it starts with this conceiving or co-constructing a theory of change with our counterparts, which itself helps to contextualize the application of the tool. We as academics arrived before those projects with an idea in mind what we will be doing. But once we create the theory of change together with stakeholders, we then see, okay, this might not be useful for this particular project, and this part of the tool can be useful. So at the end of the day, we may have not a hammer, we may have a screwdriver, but we may use it not to tighten a screw, but to produce a screwdriver cocktail, vodka and orange juice. So this is my insight into this project, and I'm happy to follow it up.
Okay, Caetano. I look forward to drinking your cocktail. So let me just say two words about what I've heard, which may be quite interesting. I mean, I've heard some surprises from Sandra, who talked about how initially we assumed, because it's interesting, this move from this academic network space to this fluid space. You have to be ready for surprises. You have to be ready for challenges, and some of the assumptions that us as academics make have to be challenged. So one of them is that we're going to work with a niche, and Vinnova found this a little bit difficult because they're used to working with the regime, or perhaps within the regime they were hoping to find niches. So it's very important, in my opinion, that this issue of representations of space, how actors represent their space, which is their geographies, but through institutions, through their organizations or whatever it is taken into account. So that's one thing. What surprises did we find for us to be able to work properly on this? The second, which came up, I think, is the enormous flexibility that one requires to maintain within this relative space. If something doesn't work, you try something else, you're flexible. So this space, this fluid space, really does become a very, very easy space to work in, where you can move around, and everybody has to be into that logic, I think. And the third one is it actually requires quite a lot of skill, quite a lot of ability to do this, which may not be available everywhere. And what are the implications of that? So let me go on to a second question then. And by the way, the audience, please do write in your questions, because I think we're dealing with really key issues about transformative innovation policy, and we'd love to hear your reflections, your questions about what you think about this. And the question is, in what way has the framework of TIP adapted or been used flexibly across different spaces? And how can we achieve flexible application, that this is the important thing, whilst maintaining the principles and aims of transformative change? So how far does that flexibility arise? What happens if people use the words that we are using, but with completely different definitions, as has happened to us in many cases as well, because that leads to complete... Have you found these sorts of problems? So maybe we can start with Alejandra again. I think you're muted, Alejandra. Okay, we can hear you now. That's fine.
Okay. Could you show the presentation as well, please?
Right.
The other slides, Matthias.
It's coming.
Okay, thanks. Well, keep my reflection on what has been our engagement with Vinnova, and I frame this in this mutable fluid space. So I think there are some ingredients, no, that make possible to navigate in this mutable fluid space and also be coherent with the aim of and the tools of the methodology. I think I shared these thoughts in other moments, but well, I'm going to repeat some of them and maybe some new one. Well, I think in this space, no, of co-creation, mutual understanding and trust building is essential. So it's positive, and that trigger learning, reflexivity, and it's something that you have to create and to maintain through all the engagement. This is difficult and takes time, that's sure, but it's really important. And in this space, this mutable fluid space should be safe and respectful. So it should be a space in which people can talk, can share, can say something, can define first one thing and then go back. So it's part of the interaction with the group of policymakers, and also between us, between the researchers. Flexibility, as you point, Matthias. So we have to remain flexible through all the process. We have to remain flexible about what we want to get, the outcomes. I mean, the theory of change is not the result of the engagement. It's a tool that we are using. It's a mechanism that we are using, but it's not the end point. And also the theory of change is flexible, so we have to discuss and in the definition of the outcomes, of the assumption, of the links between activities and outputs and outcomes, etc. And also, but we have to remain flexible with that, no, and understand failures or diversion to the regional plan as an opportunity of learning. We have to act as bricoleurs, so we have to merge techniques, and we did in Vinova. We used the theory of change, but also we use the learning history. Now part of the team is doing interviews. We are going to have another moment of interaction with the Vinova team and use the learning history for a learning space inside the organization. So we have to act as bricoleurs, no, in these engagements. Matthias, next one, please. In Vinova has been really relevant, maybe more than in the climate kick interaction, in my view, but in Vinova has been really important having inside translators, so people inside the organization that dedicate time, that are interested and even passionate, no, with the formative evaluation engagement. And this figure, no, the translator, they act, no, between us and the rest of the team. They provide us with insights of the inside organization in Vinova, from more practical issues like agendas and things like that, but also about context of what is going on or what we're going on inside the organization. And also they help us to translate our concepts in something more understandable for the team. So this is really, really important. And I think in Vinova, the figure of one of the members of the team acting as a translator was really relevant. Without her, probably, I don't know, the process probably went through another avenue and make the process more difficult, and who knows. So for us has been really relevant. And the third reflection, the next slide, Matthias, please. The third reflection is about the attitudes. Andrew from the audience is asking me about causal mechanism. Well, if I have to say something that is important in our engagement is to keep good attitudes. Of course, we need to know the methodology, we need to know the outcomes, we need to know how to co-create these spaces, how to facilitate a workshop, etc. But we have to maintain an attitude, no, of a facilitator of a process of discovering together, I would say. It's not in evaluation normal. The evaluator has a judgment role. Say, okay, this is good, this is bad, this was close to what was planned, or it's different, and etc. But in our formative evaluation proposal, we are part of a process, and we have to keep these attitudes through all the process. We need to have strong co-creation skills, and this is not easy, and this is something that is not in our previous skills and abilities. No, as researchers, we were not trained as facilitator normally, so we have to, but we need that also because we are doing formative evaluation and part of transformative innovation policy. I think we have to make learning and reflexivity a core and take these really seriously and taking a deep learning approach. I think attitude as humility and empathy are relevant. We have to understand the others. We have to build trust. We have to keep this safe and respectful space. So this is really important. And also I will remark that a will to understand people's context and be ready to listen is also an ingredient, no, to navigate in this mutable fluid space. And the same for a complex fluid space. So if we shift, no, to a more complex fluid space with other stakeholders, which I think is one of the aims of this methodology as well. The methodology is adapted to is ready to work in different spaces, in my view. So those attitudes are still really relevant. That's all, Matthias.
Okay, it's very, very interesting. Okay, Cayetano, what about yourself? What's your how would you sort of respond to this this question? Do you want me to repeat the question, or do you remember it?
Can you repeat? Well, I think it's about the flexible application, but if you want.
Yeah, I mean, in what way has the framework of thinking about moving from an immutable space? So if you think about TIPC developing with a group of academics and being sort of said, okay, here you are, here it is, which is probably the way most of us began, I have to say. And then the adaptations and the flexibilities to work across different spaces. And the key issue for me is how do we maintain that flexibility, but at the same time, maintain the principles and the aims of transformative change, which means that perhaps there are some places where we don't want to go, or we can't go, or we say that's different to what we're trying to do. I don't know if you face those sorts of discussions.
Yeah. So I'll repeat something that I said in my first intervention, but then elaborate. The first point that we faced is that this fluid space, it's not out there. It doesn't exist unless you create it. And this is a continuous process. We need to create and recreate this fluid space every time. Every time we interact with our counterparts, be them civil society stakeholders or policymakers or civil servants, this needs to be created. This dialogue needs to be constant. Even if the geographical context is the same, or the settings of the organizational setting is the same, this is something that it only exists once you mobilize it. And if you don't mobilize it, it disappears, I would say. So that's the first and foremost point. Every time we would come back to interact with our counterparts, we had to establish that dialogue. We had to try to translate our concepts to a language that is relatable, and we had to be listeners as much as talkers. So you should not wear the hat of the teacher or the lecturer, but actually listen to their expectations and to the needs of those that we are assisting with the application of this tool. And I think that despite its flexibility, or maybe because of it, the application of the TIPC methodology was not really straightforward. The challenge of applying it while keeping its conceptual underpinning was in the translation of the concepts to the world of practice, while we would need also to ensure their relevance to a specific context. What did that mean? That means that those concepts of circulation, for instance, the transformative outcomes, circulation, upscaling, and so on, they are really detached from the realities that we faced. And we had to give very concrete examples related to how the project would frame the issue and establish their desired impacts. It was also facilitated when through the creation of this fluid space and through the dialogues that we established with the counterparts, and we also could with visual tools. It was also another way that we would ensure this translation of concepts to practice. This was also achieved through creativity. You need creativity to be able to communicate something that is not really so straightforward. So I think that the strength of the methodology that we piloted was to work also with modules that are deployed incrementally. You don't present everything at once, but you start very small. We start with establishing a common vocabulary, and then we move forward together, and only move forward to the next step when the counterparts or the partners say they are ready, that they perceive themselves as ready to move forward. So this step-by-step approach to transformative experiments, I think, is also another strength.
Okay, well, thank you very much. So what have we got? I mean, these are great answers because they really bring out some of the lessons. But what have we got? We need high skills. We need an enormous amount of flexibility. We need translators. We need champions. We need a particular type of attitude, and we need things to be probably incremental and actionable. So we're getting quite a list here of sort of learnings that we need to do to implement this. Okay, and that's something which we need to think about. So what I'd like to do now, please, I'd like to bring in Imran. Imran, you've heard Imran Patel. You've heard the conversation. You've been involved yourself, obviously, and you heard the experiences of two of the experiments in Europe. I'm going to ask you two questions, Imran. The first of them is, some of us have told us that TIPSI has, perhaps because of the things that you've learned already, the things that you've seen or heard in this session, has been a fairly slow and labor-intensive process, which doesn't always fit with policymaker budgets, timescales, the demand for quick impact, which is often in a policy sort of demand. So, is there a way around this? Do you think? Can we make TIPSI more effective? Because we may have to deal with some of these things if we really want to scale this across or scale this up.
Thanks, Matthias, and thanks to the two previous speakers. I think some very, very important lessons. I think you've gone to the crux of the challenge in taking forward TIPC. It's labor intensive, and it requires a lot of expertise. What I can do, I mean, from my perspective, you need a couple of things. One is, and this is what we're trying to do in South Africa, you need local capabilities, because part of the ability to scale this up and to take it forward means we need to build local capabilities and capacities. And we're doing this with, for example, the research chair that we have at the University of Johannesburg, etc. And in the program that we ran with one of the projects, we got people involved. So this element of localization is quite important. And I think part of localization means that the kind of challenge you've thrown at us around, you know, the potential for people who grab onto the ideas and take it forward. I think you're going to have to accept a bit of that. And the comment that was made about the hammer and the tool, I want to broaden it out to talk about a toolbox as opposed to a tool. I mean, tool makers don't, hammer manufacturers didn't sit and stick around with hammers. They invented multi-tools, they invented a whole range of other things. And I think that's the challenge for us as TIPC, is to think about a toolbox that can come in at very different levels. I found that, and I'm finding it increasingly. We've delayed, for example, doing the deep dive that we did with the Living Catchments project, with other projects, mainly because people don't have the time or the capabilities, etc. And I give you a good example. One of the people in South Africa who's really taken forward the TIPC approach, but has mainly done this around the multi-level perspective, less so in terms of the transformative outcomes. She's been working on our energy portfolio and developed something called a Hydrogen Valley Initiative. Now, there was an existing project supported by other funders, other donors, etc. And she infused TIPC language in that project. Not entirely in the way that we would have done with the Living Catchments team, but enough to get the momentum going around what needs to be done. So part of the solution is, and we're adopting this, is to be broad-based for the next couple of years. And as people take on the language, they will then adopt it in ways that are appropriate to their circumstances. So there may be people who, and the Living Catchments team then made the commitment to go into the process much more fuller. There are many, many others. I mean, we're working with 8 or 9 different policy experiments, and in each instance, you need a very personalized strategy with the continuous need to evolve the tools that you are developing, tools that can be applied in different cases. The comment I made yesterday, and I'll conclude on this at the other session that I was on, is that we need to see this as a journey. Transformative change is a long-term process. And if we have to replicate, again, using the notion of a hammer, I mean, before it was people, pounding things through with a rock. Now we've developed some very, very sophisticated tools, digital, electronic, even hammers are done in a very different way. And it's that ongoing process of trying to understand the market for the language and for the understanding and to be able to take it forward. So I don't think that there's any solution to that. One additional comment is you can't do this for everything. You need to be very targeted around this. It's like transdisciplinary work in general, transdisciplinary projects. And I remember once upon a time we were discussing with Future Earth, and they were talking about the need to have more transdisciplinary projects, and they saw it as more a pyramid, with the pinnacle being a set of projects that would adopt the transdisciplinary approach, but that has the benefits of then filtering downwards into a range of other initiatives through diffusion or as the ideas get permeated. So it's a bit of both, trying to focus in on a few, get some good case studies, examples where it's worked, use that to evolve and improve the tools, and then to be able to take it. But keep in mind a much more longer term perspective around building the kind of research infrastructure that we're talking about.
Thanks, Imran. I mean, I think it's very, very interesting, because you're talking, I mean, I picked up two things, in fact, three things, because of what you just said at the end. One is perhaps at this early stage, there's a degree of patience that one's required to do this, which isn't always there. But also you need the fluid space has to become much bigger. That's the point that I think your strategy in South Africa. It's interesting how we might define a little bit. It's not exactly a common, is it? It's not a commons where people can just come in and dip out, because yes, we've got to make it bigger, but in there it's much more like a community of practice, in the sense that within a community of practice, people develop a language, people develop method, that they understand each other. So you can't dip in and dip out like you might do in a commons. It's more like a sort of a club. We don't want to make it exclusive, but you have to commit if you're going to be there to actually make it work. But we have to make it bigger. So we need actors who can legitimize that, who can encourage others to come in, which is sometimes difficult to do when you don't have stable civil services. It's one of the problems we have in Latin America. People stay 2-3 years, very bad contracts, or they leave, and it becomes challenging within that process. But and then the final one, which is interesting, you use this triangle metaphor, which goes to the second question which I had for you, which was, I mean, how do you think in South Africa TIPSI can be scaled? And I'm mindful of the very, very different contingencies which exist, I imagine, within the different parts. Sometimes you get very parochial attitudes, sometimes you have very different realities, sometimes people engagement with their natural surroundings, but also with each other is very different. You have unique areas that have a history. So if this really takes off beyond the group, beyond the community of practice, I mean, you sort of hinted at it, I think, with your triangle, in the sense that you have some very nice cases and you do your best to develop the lessons. Is there anything more you want to say? Maybe just a couple of minutes on that.
Yeah, I mean, I think scaling up is like, we talk about niches and regimes. I've always seen the work that we're trying to do at this formative stages of introducing the transformative innovation policy approach as a niche in itself, because you have a dominant regime, you have funders, etc. So in a way, the scaling up is going to happen in two ways. or there needs to be two targeted approaches. The first is identifying, and we've been fortunate. I mean, I saw evidence of it, by the way, just as a side note. Today, I'm on a board of one of our entities, and one of the slides talked about the 3 frames, and I could see how people are introducing this. So it's to find those champions in organizations. And I come from a bit of an activist background, so I kind of associate with activist public servants. And I think in academics, you get activist academics. Having that common activist approach helps, because you then are able to bring people together. So you have to find strong champions who are flexible, who are approaching. We've been very fortunate in South Africa with the personalities, some of whom have been on some of the platforms during this conference, who've come in, they had that kind of openness to try something different. They like the approach, they like the challenge of pushing the boundaries of doing system change. That's one. But that's the kind of niche space. The other is the regime, where you have existing funders and you have existing institutions like us. We have the Council for Scientific and Industrial Research, we have the National Research Foundation. So what we did in the first 2 years of our annual forum was to have something called an executive briefing, is to ensure that you're not operating so much in a niche that people are not aware of the work, but at the same time understand that people are not necessarily going to be fully taken on board, but to keep people in the loop. And that has had the benefits, because I was asked, for example, to prepare this concept of socio-technical system change for an interministerial committee. I didn't expect it, because I didn't understand whether the language was taken up. I knew it was in a slightly different context to the way I understood it, but you use the opportunity to be able to sell the idea. So in a way, this niche regime approach kind of is critical to scaling up, because you're going to have to do both, keep the niches going, and at the same time identify the benefit of my particular position is that you are able to experiment with some of the instruments that are working at the system level. So we are able to engage with the NRF and say, let's try to, for example, create a funding stream for challenge-led approaches as an example, and you use that to take it forward. So I think that's part of the scaling up. But part of the issue that I raised earlier is that this is not a short-term journey; it's a long-term journey, and the patience is going to be there. It's small steps, but it builds up. It builds up a kind of a critical mass.
Okay, I think that's very, very interesting from the policy perspective, how you see this process emerging, scaling up through both niches and keep the regime, which is very much in the spirit, I think, of the multi-level perspective. Okay, so we've got maybe about 10 minutes or something like that, maybe a little bit less, just to deal with 1 or 2 questions. So please, we've got a little bit of time. So I want to take up one question which has been asked by Geisha Sanchez. Hello, Geisha, thanks for your question. So the question is the following, and I would invite any of the 3 of you, maybe we could have the 3 of you on the screen here, if we could do that. And it's the following: do different perspectives on sustainability become an issue in this process? Okay, so different people have different perspectives. They see it in a different way. Some may see it very top-down way. And if yes, how do the facilitators navigate through this process? I mean, that's an interesting question, particularly where there's tension involved in some processes. I'll give you one example where we work. There's one of the places we work, there's been a big battle, if you like, political battle between the mayor and a group of industrialists. And the mayor has taken some of our language, particularly this idea of destabilizing the regime, you know, into his armory. And suddenly we find ourselves in the crossfire between a group of industrialists and something that nothing to do with us. And we are being invited to participate in that process. So these aren't easy issues where there are different differences involved. So this may bring Caetano back to his Brazilian experience, but it's not just about polarizations. It's also about simply different visions, different visions of the way you work on sustainability. Perhaps the difference between relative and absolute. There's a demand for quick, you know, tools because that's what they're used to. So maybe I don't know, Caetano, Sandra, would you like to say anything about that?
Caetano, if you want to start.
Yeah, well, to bring home in the sense that looking at the project, we didn't have this disagreement about sustainability, but we or the counterparts, the partners, having a different perspective of what sustainability means. But part of our project, the one that I was focusing on, SUSMO, Sustainable Shared Mobility, was an assumption that you cannot expect that shared mobility will be sustainable, that sustainability needs also to be constructed in the case of shared mobility. And part of the tools that were, because there are two levels of tools, our Tipsy tools, and in the partner project, they wanted to develop their own tools for evaluation. And part of the tools was based precisely to try to measure the sustainability potential of certain mobility solutions. So what I can say is that in our project, there was no preconception of sustainability and therefore no disagreement, because it was more of a constructivist process of establishing what does it mean to be sustainable in the case of shared mobility. As to the case of Brazil, I can come back to it later, but I will give opportunity to Sandra and Imran to answer the question too.
Okay, I was trying to remember in Vinova, I don't remember some disagreement about sustainability. What I can remember in Vinova is they were really interested in explore this as an outcome of the intervention, because in the previous design of the intervention, this is something that I've remarked in the chat. When we arrived to Vinova, there was something happening before. And this is really important in formative evaluation. It's not the same to start the engagement since the beginning. So, okay, let's design together a new policy intervention using the transformative outcomes or whatever, or let's bring our methodology and the transformative outcome to a previous intervention. No? This is something, I think, different and is part of the difficulties that we have faced in Vinova, and also is part of our learnings, but that happened. No? So in Vinova, they were interested in exploring the different ideas around sustainability between the regime actors. That's why they choose this that outcome, but was not an issue, no? The difference, it just was an interest from them to explore that. And if I think in other engagements, and even in Vinova, I think some concepts that are more discussed, no, and need are the concept of regime and niche. This is not straightforward, so it's not easy to elaborate about what is, who are the regime actors, who are the niche actors, no, are enough with us that belong to maybe a public administration, a public government, to frame us as regime actor, as niche actors, or we need to bring other actors from the civil society. So we need to move to a fluid space, no, as Matthias was saying before. So this kind of discussion, I think, were more relevant and deep in our engagement, more than the the discussion about the idea of sustainability. It's more about who is the regime, who are niches. I am a niche, I'm in between the niche and the regime. So these kind of things are more challenging in our interaction in terms of concepts or core ideas in the formative evaluation and transformative outcomes.
Okay, thank you very much, Sandra. We've got very little time now, so maybe Cayetano, you could have a go just in a minute, and then I'd like Imran maybe to deal with, while we're waiting. You could look at that final question, Imran. I hope you can see the chat, the question right at the end from Andrew coming, so you can prepare that. Cayetano.
Yeah, I think in the case of my experience in Brazil, and I'm not talking just about sustainability, but also in terms of sustainability, and also to extrapolate it to a developing country or emerging market context. It's that the sustainability expectations go beyond the environmental aspect to include especially the social element. And that creates a tension between these, let's say, absolute framings of absolute frameworks that tend to focus more on sustainable transformation in terms of ecological or environmental sustainability. So that it was really one of the expectations was how to do, for instance, transformative missions that would tackle inequality or would promote social and economic inclusion, and not only address the sustainability of the natural environment. And this was a difficulty when I was working with policymakers there and other civil society stakeholders.
Absolutely. Okay, Imran, maybe you could, there's a final question, actually it's not final anymore because another one's come in, but there was a question which was to you from Andrew, which was, what do policymakers who have given you the initial opportunity to experiment demand as evidence of results to continue and maybe give greater support to your work? So what I'm picking up is we're working with people where the door is a little bit open, where the door is ajar, which I think is natural. How can you make that door bigger? Do you really need to sort of give them evidence of results, quick results? Maybe not. How do you advance that process?
Well, thanks, Andrew, for the question. I mean, I think it's not going to be replicable because in the particular instance, it's just the way in which we operate and work as the DSI and being a member of the executive committee, that flexibility exists, So there's been many opportunities that as a senior public servant, you can drive certain things. So that's been there. It hasn't been a case of it's part of your delegated responsibilities in a sense. And because we went through a white paper process to kind of reimagine where we're going to with innovation policy, the issue of the issue of impact and transformation came about strongly, and the kind of work that was happening in the TIPC resonated quite strongly at the time. And the original links with the TIPC weren't made by me, but I took it forward. So it's not an issue at this point in time. But what has been happening, because I understand that if you're investing in this and you're spending time and resources saying we're doing TIPC work, eventually people are going to be able to ask. And the way in which we've done that in the South African context is to build the kind of broad-based approach. So there are other people within the DSI, people who report to me, but also people outside of my influence and in partner departments like other government departments, etc., who found value and use in the TIPC work. And because we are keen on ensuring that science, technology, and innovation plays a bigger role in our national development efforts, having those other government departments, whether it's water or environmental affairs or mineral resources, etc., reference how the TIPC work is helping them think through some issues has helped to keep the momentum going. I haven't, as an individual championing this work, decided when is an opportune time to grow or significantly increase. It's very stepwise, and those challenges haven't been encountered as yet.
Okay, thank you very much. Can I now bring in our two super experts, Johan and Jordi Molas. Johan, is Johan, are you there? Hopefully. I think this has been a very rich discussion, and I'd like to really thank the panelists and those who have asked the questions about this. And what I'm picking up is that, and maybe we could start with Johan, your call in that paper for establishment of a meta framework is being taken up, but perhaps in a very different way than previous ideas around meta frameworks, which are perhaps, I come across this with mission orientated a lot. People use the headlines and the labels, and then off they go, and you wonder, okay, what are the original ideas are there? We see an organic development here, which is perhaps slower, but it's taking place in a different way. It's perhaps redefining the concept of what a meta framework is through a more constructed notion of this innovation policy. But at the same time, I want to remind us perhaps what one of the policymakers said from, I think he was from the OECD, and the other one from the EU, in that discussion we had on building knowledge frameworks, where they lamented some things about TIPC, that it wasn't sufficiently comprehensive, the cases, where we needed to be more clear about how to do it. And that's not easy when you've got these very, very different contexts. So can we meet halfway there? So what's the first question is, what's your sort of, how do you react to some of the discussion that you've seen and that I've tried to sort of put together in a kind of question? Maybe we're going to have 2 rounds of questions, and we've got about 11 minutes, so maybe you could just 2 or 3 minutes tell us what you think. You're mute, Johan. You're still mute. You're still mute, Johan. Okay, maybe we should try Jordi first. Can we hear you, Jordi? No, I think both Jordi and Johan are mute at the moment.
By you.
Right, okay. I can hear you now. No, I haven't done anything. Okay, Jordi. No, sorry, Johan, can you say something? No, we still can't hear you. Jordi, we can hear you. Or we could.
You can hear me now?
Yes, we can hear you.
Oh, wonder. It tells me the system that you cannot hear me. So sorry, I've forgotten the question now.
Okay, so it's what we've been talking about is a particular way of scaling up, which has been very different. Not scaling up, the meta framework, a particular way of thinking about a meta framework, been different to other ones. It's much more constructed. It's much more local, patient building up. Then we're reminded of some of the higher policymakers of the OECD and what they're saying and what they're demanding from us, which is to have much more consistent, robust ways of thinking about how you do it, talking their language. Can we meet them halfway, or is this going to be a problem for us?
One thing I've liked of this session and the way you have set it up is that you have set it up as a set of the dichotomies. Dichotomies are not very popular among academics because they are thought to be simplistic, but I think they work quite well when you define policy issues and policy debates when there are stark differences. And one of your dichotomies at the very beginning, which was not then reflected too much in the presentations. The presentations, I think, were very good at saying how the common meta frameworks then could be translated into very contextual applied frameworks. So there was a lot about this, and I think we can do this, and we have shown to apply generic notions to very specific contexts and do this in a co-creative way. But one of the points we made at the beginning was this difference between absolute frameworks and relative frameworks, a way of seeing the definition and evaluation of policy as something that it can be measured with standard approaches and homogenized systems of management, a governance that is well structured and can be centralized effectively. And that's an absolute. And our framework is completely different. Our framework is relative framework in which context matters. And therefore, if context matters, the means of evaluation and assessment have to be contextual and differentiated. And it can only be managed through a devolved system of governance. Therefore, my answer to your question is no. I don't meet them halfway. I'm staying with my relative frameworks, and I will debate the need of absolute frameworks in the case of transformative innovation policy until I retire.
Okay.
I am in for a strong debate.
You don't
so
see
can
a
you hear me
hybrid
now?
Oh, we can hear you now, Johan. Maybe you could come back to that. Yep.
Okay. I also would like to say that it was a very rich session and an important topic. So I want to make a number of remarks. One is, I think a lot of the academic policy interaction is often done in a short-term way, in a way. So there's a contract or a consultancy. So TIPSI was set up to do a long-term interaction and allow for mutual learning. So therefore, it was 5 years because all the translation work necessary takes a long time. So researchers and policymakers need to build up capabilities, in fact. So it's a learning process on both sides. Secondly, the kind of what you call absolute framing and relative framing, I think the crucial thing is to move in between, to move from absolute to relative and back. And the type, you can also think about the type of absolute framing. What do you mean by this? Well, I would say these are templates and these are concepts that are open. So you have the notion of open standards. So they are easy to appropriate locally and to work with, yet at the same time there are generic elements to it. And these generic elements are necessary to talk across contexts, in fact. Because if everything is locally specific, how do you talk and how do you accumulate experience and theory? So it's the movement back and forth that's important. And I think that's what we have been trying to do. It is difficult, it's time consuming. So we really need to think about the issue that was raised about that the practice we have been developing is too time consuming. But in any case, also the organization of TIPSI now has hubs, the Latin America hub. And so you need a decentralized approach for the learning platform that we are developing. I hope that we can develop that in the next phase to do this type of work.
Can I just, we have probably time, I'd like to actually develop this issue between the two of you, because I think, Johan, you reflect in some ways, some of the early work by Gilles and Dalton, where they talked about you start in a very contextual space, you you have to have an impact at the regime level, you have to decontextualize and then or de-embed and then re-embed again. at a different at another stage, which is a process of codification. Okay, but that's a little bit different to moving between a relative and an absolute space. Codification can take place, I think, within a relative space. Absolute, I suppose, is just a way of simplifying everything and moving along a particular framing. Now, I'm going to go back to Geordie in a minute. One of the things which I found, and this was actually something we found in South Africa, which was interesting, was that often you work within, this was in project management, where the formal rules were around very absolute spaces. So you have to deliver on time, etc. But the application was very relative. There was no other way. And the project management knew that, but it was kept in the shadows. So this is an example of where you have these two co-constructing, because we have agency, but we don't choose the context in which that's created. So we have to, don't you think, Geordie, have to deal with these issues constantly of having to push things down to what we're trying to do. I mean, it's this hybrid space where we have to work in.
Yeah, I would not call this space hybrid. I will call it two parallel spaces. So you will have a means of management of governance that moves on more absolute terms in the way you mentioned, with an auditing approach, and you manage in parallel to create a niche that implements another logic of governance, which is very, very different. And you are right that you cannot, maybe I was a bit too extreme in my presentation, making it a bit of as a constant fight. It may not be a constant fight, but there has to be a deliberate attempt at protecting the relative approach, the relative framework, and a kind of governance that is more cooperative, more collaborative, and more devolved from the trends and tendencies in many, many governments to equate efficiency with centralization. And that's a huge problem. And therefore, I don't think it's meeting them halfway. I think if you manage to work in parallel and protecting your niche, you will have done a lot. And I think what Johan said, that obviously was very different from what I said. Yes, what Johan said makes a lot of sense when you're thinking about constructing knowledge and constructing theory. But when you're thinking about implementing policy, which is a different thing, then this coming back and forth, I just don't understand it. I don't understand how you can come back and forth within two extremely different ways of seeing governance within the framework of the same policy. You just cannot do that. You go one or the other. There's no middle ground.
So just the Johan, do you think we can meet? I mean, we heard when we were talking about knowledge infrastructure, we heard some very interesting comments, honest comments, I think, from people like Philippe and so on, when he was saying to us, well, I mean, how do you what we need to do is how do you do TIP? What are the instruments? What is the administrative processes? There was, we've done some of this, but there's just a gap still, in terms of, for example, how we report our case studies. Do you really think we can meet those ends so that this can be taken up at a bigger level without violating, as Geordie, I think, is trying to insinuate, our principles?
Yes, I think we can. But again, I don't really understand your objection to this movement, Jordi. Also for policy. Of course, so if you develop a database, for example, and I was in this session where the OECD was presenting their compass. They try to this larger database. I think there is an issue with that standardization can become, or codification can become a barrier. So there should always be a lot of space for contextualization. But you need to compare, and you need to translate. You need to, to come up with generic elements. And I think the whole discipline of this is also important, that you try to do this. So there are many barriers to this, in terms of time, in terms of interactions, but I don't see a principle.
But Johan, why do you want to compare? Why are you so interested in comparing? If the contexts are so different, why is comparison so important?
Well, because you can learn a lot from the contrasts, and why things happen in certain cases and not. You can do counterfactuals.
Okay.
And in a way, that's also part of the scientific method to do that.
Yeah. Okay, I agree, but then this is a different kind of comparison than the one that you would do by using benchmarks, for instance. But you compare by looking at the differences and not by trying to compare on standardized measures.
No.
It's a different kind of comparison, right?
Mm.
Yeah.
It seems that we've begun to touch...
You met halfway.
Yeah, well, that's good. We've begun to touch some very interesting issues, which I think, TIPSI is now entering its 5th year, which is, Johan said we had 5 years. We're entering the last year. It's a different stage, I think, of the work that we have. And we've talked about the 2 aspects of it, the how to upscale and how to across scale, if you like. So anyway, thank you everyone for coming. Thank you to the panelists for the conclusions. I hope we continue. Well, we will continue this discussion. And if you're not already, involved in the work that we do, I hope you will get involved either through our hubs or through our locally or wherever it is that we work. So I'll finish the session there. And thank you everyone for coming. And I hope you enjoy the rest of the days. Thank you.